Hi everybody, Dr. Stringer is back to talk to you all this week about sentencing. We're on to Module 12, and I hope you guys are interested in sentencing because we're going to have a couple modules of it. With that, I hope everybody remembered to do their discussion boards and their quiz from last week. And we'll dive into talking about sentencing. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea of sentencing because you have probably seen it on TV or heard about someone getting sentenced or something like that along the way of your lives. And so what happens when someone is convicted of a crime after they're found guilty or they plead guilty or no contest, as we talked about before, then they end up in what is known as the sentencing phase. And usually this will be a separate court date. They'll have the trial date, and then after the trial, then they'll set a separate date for sentencing. This is usually because they will, in most states that require this, they have what is known as a pre-sentencing report that has to be completed. It's usually done by a probation or parole officer. It's about the person's history and kind of, all of these different factors that play into sentencing. And then actually the probation or parole officer will then actually make a recommendation, and this usually involves the sentencing guidelines and things like that, which we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about today. But just know for now that sentencing is kind of this bifurcated process where first the judge decides whether you're going to be incarcerated as part of your sentence or you're going to be on some sort of community decision or community supervision. And this is in the federal sentencing data in the federal system. This is known as the in-out decision. Are you going to be in the prison, or are you going to be out of a prison and in some sort of community supervision? And then the second part is the judge then decides what conditions go along with the sentence. And so we'll talk about some different conditions that might involve the sentences. Generally, the judge will not be placing conditions on what happens to you when you go to prison. The Department of Corrections will handle all of that, and the judge really doesn't have very much to do with that at all. And then people will be classified and all of these other things that we'll talk about later that occur, as far as once you get to the prison, they decide what your security risk is and all these things. The judge doesn't have anything to do with that. But they might decide that you're to serve a certain amount of time on probation. They can decide your incarceration terms, as well as any kind of intermediate sanctions that you might have, like house arrest, ankle bracelet, GPS monitoring, random drug screens, anger management, the list goes on of these sorts of things that you could have. And so the judge decides all of these things when they're deciding whether to sentence you or not. Some of you might be familiar with the basic ideas about what sentencing is supposed to accomplish, so to speak. There's different ideas when it comes to what the sentence is supposed to be. The first being retribution, that you're supposed to punish the offenders for committing this crime. And this gets back to the idea of an eye for an eye, that the punishment should fit the crime, and kind of Hammurabi's code and things like that you've probably heard about in your 1101 class. So this might not be a whole lot of new information, but that you should generally hold offenders accountable for their crimes. You shouldn't punish them excessively, so it should be proportionate to the crime. This does have some limitations though, right? And so, there's a lot of evidence that says that punishment is not decided solely on the basis of the seriousness of the offense. There's a lot of other things that go into that. So these are all things to think about. And the thing to think about too is it's only really concerned with past behavior and not the possibility of preventing future crime, which is another thing that we think about when we think about deterrence, right? We don't think about, necessarily we want to punish them for the crime. We want them to prevent to prevent them from, or deter them from committing future crimes. We also want to deter other people who might be inclined to commit crimes from doing so, which would be known as general deterrence, and then specific deterrence would be, discouraging the person who's sentenced from committing additional crimes once they're free, or once they're released from prison, or even once they're after the trial, if they're on some sort of intermediate sections. This gets back at the original theories of deterrence and general versus specific. Some people have argued, Stafford and Moore in 1993 said that these things can actually occur at the same time. You can be an individual can have specific and general deterrence at the same time. So that's something to think about as well. That they would argue. So there are some limitations to this as well, and the offenders don't associate criminal activity with the potential for punishment. How often do you really think about that? People with substance abuse problems, particularly, whether they be drugs, alcohol, things like that, bring into question kind of this idea of the rational mind and whether they're making rational decisions. And I could go on for a while about that, but I won't. But if you're intoxicated, or you're a heroin addict or something like that, you're under the influence of substances, or you're addicted to them, this really impacts your ability to really weigh the costs and benefits the same way that maybe you or I would. The most important thing, I think, is that the criminal justice system doesn't have a very good track record as far as catching lawbreakers. There's tons of people that break the law all the time and don't get caught. And so that's another thing that Stafford and Moore went into just saying in their paper where they elaborated on deterrence theory. They said, all these times that people go and they commit crimes and they don't get caught and they avoid punishment, this actually does more to actually increase criminal behavior than the threat of actually being punished does, because they keep avoiding the punishment. And so they think, well, I can do this, I'll get away with it. And so they continue to do so. So incapacitation, you've probably heard about as well. This is the idea that, well, while we put you in the prison, you can't commit any crimes, which is not necessarily true, because you can still commit crimes in the prison. It's just not the victims of the crimes are not going to be the general citizens of society. There'll be other inmates. So something to think about. If we put this serial killer in prison, it doesn't necessarily mean that he won't kill anyone else. It just means he won't kill anybody that's outside of the prison. So we use this idea of incapacitation, and it is one of the main ideas when it comes to this massive prison industrial complex that we have in the United States, where we lock up so many people. A lot of people joke about it as being the land of the free and the home of the incarcerated, because we have so many people behind bars in this country, many of which, or the vast majority of them, are due to drugs. But anyway, the target of habitual or repeat offenders, you really, they start to think, well, we've tried to rehabilitate you, we've tried to deter you. At this point, we're essentially just going to lock you up and throw away the key, because you're a recidivist. For those of you that don't know, that means that you continue to commit criminal behavior after you've been caught multiple times. And so they say, well, what are we supposed to do with these people? And so they say, well, we're just going, since we can't get them to stop committing crimes, we'll just incapacitate them and prevent them that way. So then that way they won't be able to do that. One big thing with this is incapacitation is extremely costly. The last I looked, the estimate was about $30,000 a year, I think, per person, per inmate, and that's for maximum security. So $30,000 a year per inmate. I mean, you can just do the math on how many people are locked up. That's a lot of money. So, in the end of the day, it is a rather fairly short-sighted perspective. There are ideas that people can be otherwise reformed, which talks about rehabilitation, which is the next thing I'll talk about. And it ignores a lot of research that says, a lot of people, there is something called this age crime curve, where, eventually you get older and you stop committing crimes, and so you don't need to be incapacitated. One of the big things too is you have to think about is a lot of these people are going to be incapacitated for maybe 5-10 years, but then they're going to get released. And so, some of the people that get released from prisons are not, they're not made much better by being in the prison. A lot of them come out actually worse than they were when they go in. They go in for some sort of minor, not really minor offense, but probably some sort of petty drug offense, and then they come out being a much more developed criminal. So the next idea behind sentencing is the idea of rehabilitation, right? So that we can kind of treat offenders so that they eventually readjust to society and become law-abiding citizens. And this, very good examples of this would be drug treatment programs, anger management, job skills, things like that. And there is evidence that says that, these methods can work. It really depends across different types of methods, but there is some evidence out there. And then again, there are also some people who you're just not going to be able to rehabilitate no matter how much you try. So that does happen as well. There's also people you're not going to deter. And so what do you do with them? I don't know. Maybe you do just put those handful of people in prison. But then again, those are not all of the people that are in the prisons nowadays. That's just kind of our go-to thing. We're going to lock you up, and we'll do that. And that is, it's a very easy thing to accomplish, right? We build a prison, we sentence people to prison, we put them there. You're just warehousing them in the prison. It's a whole lot easier than trying to rehabilitate someone or change the way they think and stuff like that, right? I mean, anybody can just lock someone up in a cell. It's not that challenging. It doesn't take a lot of thought. But we like to challenge these ideas and think about, well, maybe we could do something different here. Maybe something would be not only more cost effective, but would actually be more successful at reducing recidivism. So I've already kind of talked about there's some people that are not going to change. So there is kind of this limitation of rehabilitation that we can't assume that all people are going to want to change. Excuse me. And rehabilitation does take a lot of time and cost a lot of money. So one of the big problems with it today is, we have this idea of being hard and tough on crime. So it's very hard to get funds for these types of programs. And even when it does occur, politicians and a lot of the public want to see these very quick fixes. So we sent you to rehab for a month. Well, we expect you to be cured of whatever addiction you have right now, immediately. And these things don't usually work that quickly. Sometimes there will be relapses and things like that, and so then people think, well, we sent you to rehab, that didn't work, okay, now we're sending you to prison. But an actual part of the rehabilitation process is actually, especially when it comes to drugs, and I know because I was actually a rehabilitation specialist some years ago when I was working on my undergraduate degree, so I know that a lot of the people that end up, in these programs end up relapsing, and then they come back, and then, the biggest problem that I've seen with people that relapse is they go and they hang out with their old friends again. They stay away from those other people that are addicted to drugs, but then they end up hanging out with them, and then, it's all over after that. So that's a big thing to do with that. Of course, it doesn't have much to do with sentencing, but just a little side note. With that being said, that's all I had to say for you guys for this week. Please be sure to read the chapters, and don't forget to read those, small articles at the end of the chapters as well. And don't forget your quiz and discussion boards, and I'll talk to you all next week. Thanks.